Thank you for everybody that was here on time. We're still waiting for some more folk to come in, but we're going to make a start because I don't want to make you guys late. We always try and give you some time back at the end. So I'm going to pass over to Cathryn Barnard, who's one of the founding partners, Director of Working the Future. Cat, over to you.
Thank you very much. So hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. So this webinar, this presentation that I'm about to give is a build on a webinar that we delivered for APSCo OutSource members in, what was it, November?
Yep.
Mel?
Yeah, last November.
And the reason we got together, so we've been a strategic partner to APSCo for the last year or so. Mel and I met a couple of years ago on a sort of research project, wasn't it, for digging into employee engagement. And so what we wanted to do today was to build on the previous webinar, which is really digging into some of the trends that are reshaping the labour market and obviously then having an impact on how you guys are going about recruiting and the extent to which those recruitment endeavours are proving fruitful or not. There's a lot going on in the labour market. So we're going to dive into 3 trends in particular. And we're going to look at what those trends are, some of the reasons why they've come to be, and some ideas for how you might take those trends to your clients and help educate and mitigate really the risks to leverage the opportunities. So without further ado, I'm going to dive in. I'm hoping that I'm going to whip through it at quite a canter, and then at the end we'll have space for a Q&A. So anything that pops up for you as we're going along, just make a note, and then we're happy to sort of chew the fat at the end and see what you're making of these trends and what thoughts you have about it. But just to kick off then, a little tiny bit about us, Working the Future. We set up the business in 2016. I myself come from a staffing background. I entered the recruitment sector in 1994 and worked for over a decade with mobile phone operators across Europe, building and launching 2nd and 3rd generation mobile phone networks. And I've always stayed in technology staffing up until setting up Working the Future in 2016. And the reason why we set up Working the Future is that we had foreseen some of these work trends that were going to fundamentally reshape the nature of employment, obviously accelerated by COVID lockdowns and shifting attitudes towards work. We are now in 2024, I would say, right bang in the headwinds of convergent trends, and I know that's causing a huge amount of challenge for most organisations as they try and navigate the labour market and access to the talent that they need to sustain their commercial success. So that's kind of a little bit of a background about us. What we have done over the course of the last 7 years is pinpoint and identify 10 key trends that we see as most pivotal to the transformation of work. And for APSCo and the conversations that I've had with Mel, we've identified 3 trends, the ones there highlighted in orange, that we think are going to be of most interest to you as you try and navigate the labour market yourselves and add value, continue to add strategic value to your client work. So those 3 we're going to dive into, but we're going to kick off just with a short appraisal of where we at Working the Future see the 2024 labour market. I think the most important point that I would stress to you guys this morning is that it often, and we all do this, we fail to see the water that we're swimming in because we're so immersed in, you know, our daily activities of sourcing and selecting and delivering candidates to our clients. It, you know, sometimes you don't necessarily see the ebbs and flows of the wider panoramic landscape. So I just want to throw a few data points out there at you so that you know, hopefully can start thinking about that more holistically as you're moving forward. I'm just going to take a drink of water. I don't know what's happened to my throat. So we're at this really strange place in the labour market now. We have entered a labour market that is slowly starting to contract and shrink due to an ageing population. And what that fundamentally means is that we have got more people starting to think about exiting the workplace than we have entering. Part of that, well, the main driver behind that reason is that baby boomers, those born immediately after the Second World War, are starting to retire. And as the name of that generational cohort suggests, you know, straight after the Second World War, we had a massive spike in birth rates that have never been seen again. So that in and of itself would explain why we've got a shrinking labour market. But in addition to which, birth rates across most developed countries have tapered off over the last sort of 30 or so years, and that's putting a squeeze on organisational access to talent. In addition to which, we've got low engagement, but specifically in Europe. I don't know how many of you look at Gallup's annualised data, but they produce a state of the workplace report, which is always interesting to look at. And unfortunately for Europe, we've got one of the lowest engagement levels globally at the moment. So that will have some bearing on productivity and be feeding the frustration that C-suite executives in organisations will be experiencing. 80% of UK businesses are reporting skills shortages, according to some data that was pulled together by Manpower at the beginning of the year. And we've also got this particular conundrum, which was a generic conundrum, but we seem to be experiencing more economic inactivity in the UK than in some other European countries. I think the BBC reported on this in March, and in March there were some 9.2 million people aged between 16 and 64 in the UK who are not in work and they're not looking for work. And actually what we've been picking up on is that while you might expect that to some extent in the older echelons of the workforce, what's really causing labour market economists some confusion and anxiety at the moment is that there's a rising number of people under the age of 25 that ought to be in the labour market that aren't in the labour market, and nobody really knows why that is. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on there that is squeezing the labour market, which means that as recruiters, we need to be working much harder to identify what's important to candidates, what they're looking for, and try and match their expectations to employer expectations. And I say that quite pointedly because I think from our point of view, we are most definitely at the end of employer-led labour markets, which means that we have to start tuning in more full-bloodedly to what candidates are actually looking for when they go about making their career choices. And they are more discerning as a cohort. They have very different attitudes to work now than I think we still base most recruitment processes on. Most job seekers now aren't as married to the idea of long-term employer commitment. I think you and I have had various conversations, haven't we, Mel, about some LinkedIn data that seems to demonstrate that the average length of tenure is much shorter than it used to be.
Yeah, I think the LinkedIn data refers to a report that they ran where on average now length of tenure is around 2 years. But they also recognise that where organisations have a really good internal mobility scheme where they move individuals around, whether that be sideways or upwards in terms of promotion, they're likely to keep people 4 times longer. So there's some real data points to encourage organisations to move people around. Internal mobility is so important.
Yeah. And some other things that are kind of influencing and shaping the labour market. I think there's a widespread latent anxiety about the long-term impact of artificial intelligence and automation on jobs. And for those industries and sectors that are already starting to introduce efficiency technologies that effectively replace human input, I think there's a greater level, definitely, of anxiety there, and it causes people to question how secure is a job, and should I be moving to somewhere that can offer me more stability and security. There's also this continuously this ongoing friction around where work should take place, and whilst obviously a great proportion of the labour market have to be fixed to location, there's something like 30+% of the overall labour market that can be location agnostic, and we're seeing a rising, an ongoing increasing demand for remote and or hybrid working, that where workers also require some autonomy. They don't want to work in environments where the where of work is mandated upon them. They want to be involved in the kind of the curation of what those new working patterns look like. And there's also an increase in demand and preference towards alternative employment types. So I think, again, I would say many organisations tend to think about permanent employment as being their kind of default preferred employment type, without necessarily giving due regard to all the different types of talent that are working in all the different types of employment, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But the short takeaway is that when employers aren't thinking in an agile way about the labour market, they are restricting their access to the full talent pool, which is probably quite dangerous right now, given the external challenges that most organisations are facing anyway. They need to be able to access the full spectrum of talent available in order to maintain their own market resilience. So I guess the big question for all organisations is, why is it so hard to find and keep the people and skills needed for sustained business health over, the medium to long term? So let's dive into the first trend. Let's have a quick look at shifting attitudes to work and some of the reasons why attitudes have changed. I think the biggest challenge that I face now is understanding the length and breadth of attitudes to work, because you think you've kind of got your head around it, and then you come across another piece of data that kind of adds more confusion to complexity. I think it's fair to say the labour market has fundamentally shifted since 2020. We've seen the quiet quitting and the great resignation and the side hustles, and we've heard about the lazy girl jobs and so on. But suffice to say, I think it's not an understatement to say that people have got very different attitudes to work now. I suspect the pandemic kind of unleashed far greater introspection about, you know, the role of work in life. And I think, you know, some of the economic data, you know, the challenge that younger work cohorts have got in accessing the housing market, or even being able to tie down rental accommodation that is stable and secure. I think that probably then accelerates a tendency to view work as a bit more, you know, as more transient than perhaps we used to think about work. We've also got a climate crisis and growing numbers of people feeling very anxious about what is being done to address those environmental issues, and increasingly, again, particularly amongst younger cohorts, people of working age taking a view on the environmental credentials of their prospective employers and making a stand. I think this Deloitte data that I'm pointing to on this slide showed that something like 20% of people that were surveyed had made an employment choice based on the inaction, you know, moving away from employers because they felt that their employers weren't taking enough climate action, and another 20 or so % saying that they plan to do that in the near future if their employers didn't pull their finger out. So, you know, just the climate crisis alone is causing people to think differently about the work they do, who they do it for, whether or not they're willing to work with ethical or perceived ethical organizations. So again, if you guys are working with and for clients who aren't visibly showcasing what they're doing to reduce carbon emissions, that's an area in which, you know, you can pull out what they are doing, what they're saying they stand for, and actually integrate that into the stories that you tell during the recruitment process. I think what we wanted to do with this webinar was just show why things are so different now. And I think, you know, I could give you a full hour and more on this topic alone, but I think suffice to say, we underestimate the extent to which the internet has increased transparency. 20 years ago, we were probably very embryonically only able to see a snapshot of employment opportunities available, whereas now anybody, you know, the first port of call would be that a job seeker will go online and they'll look at, you know, the major job boards, and then they'll start doing their own research, and they'll dig into employee review sites like Glassdoor, and they'll really do some homework on, you know, who the organisation is, what it stands for. Is it an organisation that they're going to be able to tell their mates about in the pub? Is it an organisation that they're going to feel proud to be associated with, or you know, slightly more challenged about working with? And I'll tell you anecdotally, I was with some Gen Zers a fortnight ago, and one of them was telling me about their sister, who was really quite ashamed that she'd got this brilliant graduate job, but it was in the defence sector, and she felt quite challenged about the fact that this very well-known defence contractor was basically producing products that were, you know, integral to armed combat, and she just did not know. She was kind of settling because while she was gaining lots of experience in that sector with that organisation, and arguably everything that a graduate might want from their from their second step in their career, she felt incredibly compromised that ultimately she was working for an organisation that was helping kill people in different parts of the world. So these are the kind of things that, you know, modern workers are thinking about. They're far more geared up towards an awareness of societal challenges and social issues. And there's, of course, a much greater openness about health and well-being, including, you know, attitudes to mental health, and an increased demand for decency in the boardroom. So, you know, I think whereas in days gone by, we've been far more kind of acquiescent towards styles of leadership. I think now, you know, in 2024, particularly as we approach the election, people that are of working age, certainly in the UK, are far more questioning of all things kind of ethical, really, and values based. And that causes a lot of, not only does it cause a lot more kind of movement in the labour market, but it also does drive this point about disengagement. So back to that Gallup data that I shared with you before, you know, when we've only got 13% engagement across Europe, we've got to be thinking about what is it that's going on in the minds and hearts of workers on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis that is causing them to just do the bare minimum necessary to stay in their role, and that, you know, has a massive lag effect on economic productivity at large. But we need to be, and I know this isn't necessarily a recruitment issue, by the way, but I definitely see a requirement for recruitment and talent acquisition to start working more cohesively with HR to dig into some of these areas, because if we can understand what motivates people at work, we can then use that to help encourage internal job mobility, which is something we'll come on to in a little bit. But you know, the fact remains, this low engagement, it's having a huge impact on global economic prosperity. And I think, you know, as recruiters, we've got a key opportunity here to add layers more value, strategic value to our organisations. And for those of you that are perhaps, you know, embedded with end clients and working on those rolling contracts, I think, you know, bringing some of these ideas into the next time that you go to bid for that contract renewal will do, you know, a huge amount of good, because effectively what I'm suggesting is that if you can advise your customers on some of these labour market dynamics, they will see you as a trusted partner and absolutely see you as integral to their long-term commercial future proofing.
Kat, can I just make a point on that? Because in terms of how the programs are run, there's kind of regular typically quarterly business reviews, and these are some of the opportunities for that, the bit that you just referred to, that kind of collaboration advisory point. Actually, when contracts are rebid or up for tender, it's too late. It has to be during the duration of that contract. It's the way that these businesses who are listening into your webinar right now, it's how they make themselves more sticky with their customers, how they embed themselves further and develop the relationship.
No, absolutely happy to be corrected on that, and that's absolutely so even more opportunity effectively to get stuck in and start educating your clients on the realities of the labour market, because the fact of the matter is that we are in these very different labour markets now. The other thing that I would point you to, so we've talked about the average length of employment tenure falling. We've seen some data that points to work-related stress and burnout being very much on the rise. There was some data that came out in August of last year that showed the extent to which stress and burnout are really causing an impact on overall organisational performance, and bizarrely some smaller scale research came out at the back end of last year, beginning of this year, just showing the extent to which people working in the field of HR actually are really struggling with burnout. I suppose if I was to take a big step back, that's unsurprising given the amount of workload that has fallen on people working in the people profession to get things back to normal. But if you think about it, we've got higher levels of staff turnover, we've got hybrid working, we've got, what does the impact of artificial intelligence and automation, what impact is that going to have on workforces over time? There is a lot going on for anybody who organisationally is tasked with people and performance at work. And the other thing that I would say is that we are seeing the rise of employee activism. So effectively, particularly again in younger generations, people taking an active stance within their workplaces on issues that they think are important. So you might have been aware, you might have seen climate activists at work, you might have seen people advocating more full-bloodedly for better inclusion and taking a pretty forceful stance on issues that they disagree with, which perhaps for those of us who are a bit older, we wouldn't have behaved like that because we would never have assumed that we could behave like that and get away with it. But I just feel that, younger workers in particular probably have less to lose because, they don't see employment as being a necessity that we used to think of it as you have to get a stable job in order to get apply for a mortgage and get on the housing ladder. None of that is available to younger workers, so why would they care about those kind of things as opposed to the social and environmental issues that they deem as being pivotally important? So a lot going on there with shifting attitudes to work, but if I was to call it and suggest some pathways forward, I think it's an absolute imperative that all organisations educate themselves on the new labour market dynamics, because if you don't understand what's going on in the labour market, you cannot revise your talent acquisition and employee value proposition to incorporate what matters for modern workers. I think we also have to get our heads around the fact that being at the end of one size fits all employment means that we have to start designing colleague experiences according to individual preferences. And I appreciate that that's not so much of a recruitment issue as an HR issue, but from your point of view, you're going out and you're kind of, selling and marketing these opportunities to potential job seekers, and they want to see that they're going to get an employee or a internal stakeholder experience that actually meets their aspirations. So it's kind of in your interest to educate your HR colleagues on some of these issues as well. And for that reason, I think at Work in the Future, we're all about advocating for the elimination of silos and better integrating the HR function, the talent acquisition function, the internal communication function, how organisations share information internally and the stories that they tell about the end-to-end employment experience. But that also extends to management and leadership. And I think, one of the things that we're very aware of is that too many organisations are so big that they've become siloed, and there's not enough cross-departmental kind of cohesive communication taking place. And last point, demonstration of values and ethics and equity across all aspects of employment is really, really important. So there's lots to take away there. So I'm going to jump on now and just explore a little bit next generation talent ecosystems. So the premise here is we know that the labour market is shrinking, and we also know how many different ways there are in 2024 to employ people that possess the skills that will deliver success outcomes for organisations. So if we're not harnessing all of those different employment types, we're fundamentally restricting our access to talent and organisational stability. There's another reason that I think this is really important, and that is that organisations are now exposed to an increasingly complex range of external factors that mean that they have to move quickly and market responsively in response to their customer demand. So we need to be thinking about agile organisations in a way that bakes in flexibility, adaptability, fluidity. Rita Gunther McGrath is a academic at, I think, Columbia Business School in the United States, and she wrote a book, The End of Competitive Advantage, gosh, more than a decade ago, and she was advocating then for a new reality, which would be that organisations would keep the permanent employees right at the kind of the epicenter of organisations, and that they would be complemented by on-demand skill sets. So skill sets and people that possess those skill sets who would deliver their expertise on demand to really give optimal flexibility to organisations so that they can move more quickly in response to external market forces. And then that does come back to, you know, the alternative workforce, and Deloitte has coined this phrase, the alternative workforce. If you Google Deloitte alternative workforce, you'll come up with a rich body of material where they showcase how they are perceiving the new labour market, and how organisations can bake in agility by leveraging all these different employment types. And I don't know how, you know, you guys are set up with your client work at the moment, but really, you know, all organisations need to be thinking about this full spectrum of talent in an ecosystem, and starting to think about the skills that they're going to need in the next 5 years and how they're going to access them. So moving away from reactive recruitment to far more proactive recruitment, and really starting to think about, you know, how do you build communities of people that you may or may not need, but if you've got them in your kind of, you know, your recruitment database, then you can access them when you need them, but really starting to flesh this out a bit more full-bloodedly. And to that end, I think we have to be real about the labour market. Statista produced some research in 2023 suggesting that by 2027, which is what, 3 years away, the US labour market would be more skewed towards impermanent employment than permanent employment. And I've since heard some data cited. There are some thinkers in the United States who think that globally by 2030, as little as 20% of the global workforce will be employed on a permanent basis. So that changes the game entirely. And I think, you know, even if those things don't materialise, the fact that these trends are being tracked gives credibility to the fact that the labour market is changing in its shape and makeup. And there are various reasons for that. You know, Some of it is to do with organisations that shed staff, and then people who have been made redundant aren't able to re-access permanent employment. But actually, in equal measure, a lot of people are deciding that freelance work is attractive to them. And again, the labour market has never been less about job stability. People are taking their fortunes into their own hands, and we need to be real and live to that and start educating our customers accordingly. Interestingly, going back to the Deloitte research, they've been working in partnership with Massachusetts Institute of Technology for the last 3 or 4 years. I'm not entirely sure whether the relationship's still ongoing, but they produced some really interesting research when they first started raising the profile of the alternative workforce back in 2021. So they'd done a survey of a C-suite survey, a global C-suite survey, and found that 87% of executive surveys were including external workers when considering their workforce makeup. But that same 87% had acknowledged that there was a complete lack of an integrated approach to managing and leading a workforce where off-payroll workers play an increasingly important role. And I don't know, again, I don't know what the precise nature of your relationships are with your customers, but that's definitely a point worth making in these quarterly roundups, that a more integrated approach needs to be baked in for organisational sustainability. So again, what are the pathways forward? I think leveraging the entire talent ecosystem, really working out what those skills are that are absolutely mission critical for an organisation to sustain itself over time, and then working out all the different pathways to being able to access that talent, those skill sets, etc. Finding new ways to source, attract, motivate, engage internal stakeholders regardless of their employment type. And then, and I appreciate this isn't in your bailiwick so much as, what organisations need to do. They need to learn how to inclusively lead and manage a full spectrum talent ecosystem. But I think just your awareness of these things can help deliver a huge amount of strategic value as you're moving forward, because you're demonstrating that you understand this new world order and these complexities. And then the final point I would say is that as you're having conversations with candidates, with these internal stakeholders, there needs to be a much broader conversation about the potency of talent mobility. So you might be coming in to an organisation to deliver against this statement of work here, and then in 12 months from now you might be moving into another part of the business because you've accumulated all of this cultural knowledge and know-how. You can move over to this part of the business. But that educational piece is everybody needs to be educated on that. Job seekers, in terms of the possibility of them being able to move around, hiring managers need to understand that they can't afford to be too they can't afford to, what's the word I'm looking for? They can't afford to hold
too prescriptive.
Thank you, my love. Just, be too prescriptive and too kind of controlling and not wanting to give up talent, because, that's a quid pro quo. It works both ways, that you can bring, that you can,
narrow's another good word.
Thank you, my love. There you go. Teamwork. So all of these things, and we need to be thinking and baking in skills first hiring. It is no longer about the right degree or where you worked in the past or what have you. It's, do you have the skills? And to which I would add, do you have the mental agility and the learning agility as a candidate to be able to lend yourself to myriad different scenarios and statements of work? So we need to be hiring for attitude more than we need to be hiring for past experience and who's done what where, which segues nicely into the third and final trend, which is that we have a reskilling emergency. And the bottom line here is that in addition to a contracting, shrinking labour market, we also have this tsunami of digital technology coming online the whole time, every hour, every day, every week. And actually, all of us, regardless of whether we're in, the boardroom or the post room, we all need to learn how to navigate all of these new technologies and what they mean for our specific roles and responsibilities. So Klaus Schwab, I don't know whether you know who he is, but he's the chief executive of the World Economic Forum. They produce really interesting labour market insights. And he wrote about this, I think in 2016, he published The Fourth Industrial Revolution, where he was really just setting out what the risks and opportunities would be as a result of what he calls the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is effectively all the different technologies that are being brought online. So robotics, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nanotechnology, 3D printing, you name it, it falls under that big umbrella. And so if you've got your finger on the pulse, the Future of Jobs report that is produced by the World Economic Forum is definitely worth looking at. It's a big, old, lofty read. I don't think they've produced one in 2024, so we're taking the data from 23, but their research showed they thought that nearly 70 million jobs could be created by 2027, but 83 million existing jobs eliminated purely by virtue of the arrival of these new workplace technologies. And so again, at a higher level, we need to be thinking more full-bloodedly about the role of work and employment in healthy, functioning societies. We need to be thinking about the people that are likely to be displaced. How can we create succession pathways in order that those people with those skills can be migrated into new areas of employment? I personally think that all the talk about universal basic income is a pipe dream, and I think that fundamentally because having a purpose and a reason to get up in the morning sits at the heart of personal well-being. And I think that, if we were to rely on a concept as abstract as universal basic income, that is just a recipe for disaster, because when people don't have structure and form to their days, that's when civilization really starts to break down. So we need to be thinking about what this means for the way that we recruit and the way that we add value to our clients. We need to be thinking about the extent to which skills are going to be disrupted, and we need to be thinking about skills migration pathways. It has been a trend that many organisations, if not most, have tended to think, oh, well, we'll just hire the skills we need from the labour market. And I just don't think that is viable as the single solution forward. We need to really be starting to think about internal skills mobility and how we can create these transitional pathways for people working within organisations. And I see recruiters, their set of expertise as being absolutely intrinsically pivotal to those conversations. So again, a greater joining up of conversations between talent acquisition, HR, organisational design and development, and so on and so forth. Principally, a reason for that is that the pace of technology evolution is outstripping our human ability to keep up. So there aren't, like, the skills that your clients might think they need in terms of digital skill sets. The labour market just isn't able to move fast enough, to keep in step with the pace at which the technology sector is evolving and adapting. Why do we have a skills crisis? Well, as I mentioned before, we have an ageing population, so more people leaving the labour market than entering it. I think it's fair to say that there's been chronic underinvestment in professional education and learning over the last 25 years. We've been, as a country, and I say this unique to the United Kingdom if anyone's dialing in from elsewhere, but we've become far too reliant on skills visas, and that has led us not to invest in developing homegrown talent. And just it's led to a complete lack of progressive thinking about how we learn at work and how we upskill ourselves, how we develop new skill sets. There's some research coming out next month from a client that we do a lot of work with, showing just the extent to which people at work are confused by the organisational strategy and how they themselves can contribute to it, because their job descriptions are completely out of sync with the work that they're actually doing in the day-to-day, X months and years later. So there's a whole kind of piece around employment that just isn't up to speed and up to date with the new market realities, and I know you guys, again, don't get involved in this, but a job description is kind of that basis statement of work for somebody entering an organisation, but how regularly are those statements of work updated, and how accurately do they match what people are actually doing in the day-to-day? And actually that brings me on to another really important point, is how many organisations really understand their own internal skills taxonomy, so the skills that they have in-house and how those skills might develop and evolve. I mean, that's a massive area of work right there, and to the best of my knowledge, not many organisations have done very much about that at all. So it's another huge opportunity that somebody somewhere needs to get stuck into, and I see that as being a massive area of potential for people working in recruitment to really deliver some strategic value to their clients. We need to be thinking differently. I think I mentioned this earlier about the skills that we need. So less about the hard skills now and more about what we're at Work in the Future calling the vital skills, the ability to think strategically and adaptively. We need like never before in our organisations, critical thinkers, people who are willing to get stuck into the challenging issue of complex problem solving. We need people with social influence. We need people who are mentally agile and flexible and resilient. And we need most urgently curious people who are not bothered about making mistakes, that recognise that making mistakes is a natural part of learning. So we need people who don't necessarily, that aren't, I know how to do this and this is what I do. We need curious minds to get stuck into all the things that we don't have answers to in our organisations. So really hiring for attitude is going to come into its own if it hasn't already. And across the board, all organisations need to be thinking about upskilling everybody for this new world order. And I say everybody with capital letters there, because I think, unfortunately, too many people in the higher echelons of management and leadership think they're immune to all of this because they're already up there in their safe place, but actually nobody's immune. And you know, as a for instance, unauthentic traditional styles of leadership will just get called out by, you know, Gen Z, younger people who just have got no time for nonsense. So we need people in the C-suite who are happy and willing to role model continuous learning, because that's how we best learn socially, who encourage learning in the flow of work, and who really advocate for and promote the regular review of skills for all, for evolution and progression. So there is an awful lot that I have just shared with you, and I realise we've only got like 5 minutes left for a Q&A, but if I was to encourage you guys to take away anything from today's session, I would say make it your business to understand labour market dynamics, and none of that is static. That is continuous ebb and flow stuff. You know, we spend our lives looking at labour market trends. You'll never have nailed it in its entirety because something else will have happened, but understanding the trends and the common themes is absolutely key. Leveraging total talent management and getting on top of that for optimised skills mobility and organisational resilience is absolutely crucial, we feel, and embracing your own continuous learning. But I think if you were to go to your clients with a fraction of what hopefully I've shared with you over the last 55 minutes, I think I'd be surprised if your clients, if your key stakeholders weren't sitting up and at least paying attention to what you share with them. So understanding labour market dynamics, understanding the trends reshaping recruitment and your customers' businesses, understanding what challenges they are germanely going to be facing, and helping them build a future of work strategy so that they are ready to and able to integrate the alternative workforce and work with an expanding array of internal stakeholders to develop and hone skills at the pace in which the market is requiring it, is going to really double down and help with their strategic planning activities and of course your own.
Thank you, Kat. That was, do you know, I can't believe it's just an hour's just flown by. Some really, really key points there. I don't know whether there's anybody who wants to ask a quick question. You can take yourself off mute if you've got a quick question, or put it in the chat. We've had a couple of comments in the chat anyway, which I think have been very interesting. What we wanted to do with this particular, with Kat's insight, was that there's so much data out there. So what Kat's done is condensed all the research and data out there and tried to share that with you in a reasonably bite-sized chunk, but also to encourage that advisory consultancy piece with your end customers, because my God, is that never been so important. But I have a massive appreciation that some of those clients put huge barriers in front of you and don't allow you in to that degree to be that, you know, strategic partner. Some are great at allowing you to be a strategic partner and some are not so great. So I appreciate that those barriers need to be overcome. But sometimes the way to do that is to take in somebody external who has that viewpoint, like a Kat of Work in the Future, who can say, actually, if you don't want to listen to us, here's the experts who do this, as Kat says, morning, noon and night, in order to bring this to you so that we can be better partners, because it is obviously all about that collaboration. And we at APSCo OutSource, we've been talking about skills and skills first approach and skills mobility. We've even talked recently about the old classic RPO models, which were very much tuned to just recruitment, and you could never talk about internal mobility or be involved in that. In fact, I remember at one point you were penalised financially for internal mobility, so it was something you certainly didn't encourage as an outsource provider. Now I know some of these models have changed, thank goodness, but there's still a long way to go. So I think it's true, Kat, you started out with 80% skill shortages, and then we cover that off with the emergence of new skills, but also jobs being eliminated. So there seems to be, whilst the numbers don't necessarily all line up, there seems to be a balance of, we're fearful that AI and tech's going to take away all these jobs, but there's an 80% skill shortage. So what are we doing about that? And the fact that all these jobs are going to be eliminated, but there's new jobs coming through. So we need people to do those. So it's a mindful, but it's definitely insightful. And what we aim to do, as hopefully members of OutSource will appreciate, we try to not only be insightful, but also give you foresight, because that's where you win with the end customer, to say, Mr. Customer, you know about this, but this is where it's heading. So let me help you with that. This is in order to make you, as I said earlier, stickier with your customer and more important. If anybody has any other questions, by all means, drop me a line. I can connect you directly to Kat. No problem. If you want to speak to Kat, to talk to her about your customers particularly, please let me know. Happy to introduce you. And as I said, the recording of this session and the slides will be available. Just drop us an email and let us know you'd like those, and we'll send them on to you. But thank you, guys. Thank you for your time. Thank you to Cathryn Barnard for her insight and support with this. And I wish you a great rest of the week, people. Have a good one. See you soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.